Hey everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 12th, 2020, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible week after week, especially those who visit patreon.com/talknerdy and pledge your support. This week's top patrons include Michael Gaucher, Mary Neva, Christopher Pitts, June Sapara, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, Dudas Infinitas, Charles Payet, Brian Holden, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Daniel Lang, David J. E. Smith, Robert Christ, and Elise Christie. Thank you all so freaking much. You guys are amazing. Also, remember you can visit the Talk Nerdy store at talknerdymerch.com, and you can, grab a t-shirt or like a hoodie if it's starting to get cold out where you live. You can grab a mug or some other cool stuff. Some of it has Killer's face on it. Other stuff says Talk Nerdy. There's even one with my license plate on it, which is a little bit weird, but I have a vanity license plate. Yes, it's shameful and embarrassing, but also really fun. All right. I am really excited about this week's episode. I think it's a super important topic. And also the author of this book is just so talented, and it's a book you guys all want to get your hands on. So this week I have a conversation with David K. Randall. He is a reporter, a senior reporter at Reuters, and he's written 3 books. His most recent is now in paperback form. It's called Black Death at the Golden Gate: The Race to Save America from the Bubonic Plague. So important, weirdly also very timely. So without any further ado, here he is, David K. Randall. Well, David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
I'm really excited, a little bit scared to talk about your new book, which actually isn't that new anymore. We're coming along after the paperback has already been released, and that was even earlier this year. But the book is Black Death at the Golden Gate: The Race to Save America from the Bubonic Plague. And of course, it's timely, even though it's written about, the turn of the century, last century.
Yeah, I didn't intend for it to be that way. It's funny. I got into this story because, I grew up in California. I live on the East Coast now, outside of New York City. And the last book I wrote was about the family that used to own all of Malibu, California. And in that story, one of the main characters, it's a true story, went up to San Francisco at the turn of the 20th century. And he wrote a letter back to his wife saying, this is the wickedest place I've ever seen, and there's rumors that the plague is here. And I was struck by that for 2 reasons. One, you hear this is the wickedest place I've ever seen. You just want to hear more. What is wickedness? I want to hear more about it. And then the other thing was the idea that there was a rumors of the plague. It seemed like an outbreak of the most terrifying disease in human history would be something that you'd either know was happening or would not. And it seemed like there'd be much gray area. But it turned out there was, and it turned out that it was one of the first and most important battles between what we now think of as modern medicine and one of the most ancient and terrifying human diseases. And when I started the book, I just thought it would be, a great tale about, how did modern medicine fight this, scary ancient disease. And there are different personalities that were important and kind of show different sides of science. I had no idea that it was going to be so topical that there would be another pandemic and we would all know what quarantine meant and have experienced it.
Right. I think in the back of our minds, those of us who, think about these sort of eschatological or these sort of existential issues, always kind of knew we were due, like it's only a matter of time. It's kind of like the big one when it comes to the San Andreas Fault. Like we know it's going to happen, but there is this sort of imperviousness that we often feel if we've grown up relatively safely throughout our lives. So it's sort of like, oh, that's historical or that's in the future. Like I know it's going to happen, but it might not happen to me. And of course, 2020 turned out to be the dumpster fire year of all dumpster fires. But of course, you started the research for this book years ago, right? Like, when did you really decide this is the book you were going to write and dig in earnest?
So the Malibu, let me think. The Malibu book came out in 2016, and that was in the back of my mind when I was working on the Malibu book that, I want to explore this next. It also just seemed naturally, if the Malibu book was my, Southern California book, then the San Francisco Plague book could be my Northern California book. And I could get all my, homesickness for California out of my system and still on the coast in peace. I really started it in 2016, in the spring of 2016. The idea that there would be anything like 2020 on the horizon just seemed like it was, dystopian fiction or an old episode of, and I remember that TV show Sliders from the 90s, one of those. But then there was the 2016 election and everything started changing. And then, as I started working on it, I started seeing these echoes of personalities that you see now in the past. And, only the last 6 months has it really seemed to go into hyperdrive in that way.
Right. And that's something that I think is going to be really important that I want to get to. This idea, it kind of reminds me of an old saying that drought is natural, but famine is man-made. And I think a lot of what you speak to in the book is very similar, that, there are these things that really occur biologically as a function of evolution, as a function of natural spillover events. But how we react to them and what our public health planning and policy are really does contribute ultimately to the lives lost, to the amount of havoc that's wreaked. And so that's something that I really do want to dive into. But before we do, I was wondering, I mean, you work, your job, other than writing books, this is your third book, is as a reporter for Reuters, and you cover all sorts of stuff in your reporting career. Have you been writing about the pandemic? Like, has this come full circle for you?
That's funny. Not as much, not directly, not writing exactly about, this is what a medical response is, or this is what, this is, on the ground reporting of this is how people are being affected, or this is, inside a hospital or anything like that. So for Reuters, I mostly cover financial markets and Wall Street, which is in a way to kind of cover everything because, it's part of the economy. If you're covering the stock market, you're essentially thinking about how you're focusing on people who are thinking so much about the future that they're betting on it, which makes it much more interesting than just thinking this is a bunch of rich people trying to get richer. So I've written about, how the pandemic response or the effects to the economy have kind of affected, financial markets, but not, let's take a look at why Moderna's or somebody else's vaccine might be maybe more or less promising than somebody else's.
Right. And of course, kind of, I don't know, circling back to the book, vaccines were, I don't know, in 1900, where were we with the whole vaccine thing? Like, I don't think we had vaccines, but we were doing some inoculations, right?
Exactly. We were just starting to get there. That's one of the things that kind of that was so interesting about the book is you kind of take a step back and think, how did we get from medicine being something and, medical care being something where, good doctor was just somebody who was really fast because you didn't have anesthesiology or anything else like that to, now the era of lab coats and microscopes and these gigantic machines or, other things that you just don't know what's happening inside. It's technology more so than anything else. What was that jump? And really through the book, I found it really was in one generation. You went from Civil War era medicine to pretty close to, you could see the outlines of modern medicine forming and a lot of the establishments that we now think of just as baseline part of our society, like the FDA or other things. That all really happened within the span of one lifespan, one generation. And that was the same generation that had to fight the plague.
Yeah, I think about like vivid historical accounts, or I should say not historical, but sort of dramatized accounts. Like my mind goes to the Soderbergh show, The Nick. I'm not sure if you ever saw that. It was
Yeah.
on Cinemax, and that was the same era, right? Just turn of the century medicine, and it was showing I think in the pilot episode, the surgical theater was getting light bulbs installed.
Hmm. Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
this is crazy. We don't think about all the things that were happening at the same time. Like, they were having to do surgery in the surgical theater it had like a skylight in the ceiling and they could only do surgery during the day. Otherwise, it would have been by candlelight.
That's one thing that really struck me too. So the first book I worked on was about the science of sleep, and it was called Dreamland. And one thing I remember working on that was struck by, like, we really haven't had electric light for that long. It's only been 100, 120 years, and that's something that's so life altering, and not just human life, but all biological life. Uh,
Right.
the one stat I remember always remembering, there's something like at least 10 million birds die every year in New York City just from crashing into buildings at night. Uh,
Ugh.
and and you start seeing, like, there was this big big power outage in Los Angeles one time, and people started calling the police and saying, I see this big milky thing in the sky. What is it? And it was the Milky Way. They'd never seen it before. There was so much light pollution. Um, and the next book I'm working on is actually about the discovery of Tyrannosaurus Rex and how that changed society and science in many ways. And it all happened in the same era too. That was 1912, or that was 1902. It was revealed in 1912.
Right. So
But
that
so
was all
many,
like you mentioned that same generation, that same like if you were alive during the plague of 1900 in San Francisco, you might have been alive during the 1918 Spanish flu. You might have been alive, during the development of anesthesia or electrical pumps during surgery to, remove liquid from an open cavity. Like these things were all being developed at the same time.
exactly. That generation who lived from 1865, the end of the Civil War, to 1945, that 80 years or so, that was amazing. You went from the end of slavery to atomic weapons.
Right. Oh, wow. That's amazing. I mean, we think about like right now we're in the most, Moore's law, like insane time because we are the generation that was born. I mean, I don't know how old you are. I'm 36. So when I was born,
I'm
the
35.
computer, there you go. Okay. So the computer was not like a normal thing that a family owned. And then as I was growing up, we got our first personal computer. And like we didn't have access to computers when I was in elementary school, really. But by the time I was in high school, we were all on the internet, even though it was like dial up. And eventually, like I wrote my college thesis, my undergraduate thesis on like a diskette, I remember. And
Yeah.
it corrupted and I paid somebody to retype my paper because I was not about to do that. And now, of course, everything's in the cloud. And so we see these massive changes in our lifespan and we think, oh my gosh, like it's the most technologically advanced we've ever been and blah, blah, blah. But the shift from almost like pre-tech in some ways, I mean, granted, the Industrial Revolution was occurring then. So yeah, the shift from this sort of like pre-tech to post-tech, um, I don't know, lifestyle really happened around the time when you wrote your book.
And that was one of the things that struck me about the plague outbreak too. It was in many ways a function of everything that was changing and the technological advances at the time. This is really the start of globalization in many ways. This is the era of steamships where for the first time someone could cross an ocean, and if they had a disease like the plague, they could still live long enough to pass it on to somebody else. It wouldn't just infect everybody on board, and every 2 weeks everybody would be dead, and they'd just be stuck in the Atlantic or the Pacific somewhere. This was the first time where San Francisco really was as connected to Asia as it was to the East Coast, and in many ways it was easier to get to Honolulu or Tokyo than it was to get to New York City from San Francisco for a long time.
And of course, this Chinatown connection, I think, is going to be really, really important for for the story. But before we dive into that, I was thinking maybe we could take a step back and, we've been talking, okay, the plague in the 1900 or in 1900, the plague in San Francisco. Some people listening might be like, I thought the plague only existed in Europe in the Middle Ages. They might not realize that bubonic plague is around right now and people still get it. We just have good treatments for it. So maybe can you set the stage for the plague in San Francisco in 1900? Like, what did we know? What did we not know? And maybe we can start telling that story of how it popped up.
Sure thing. So it was the same plague, the same disease that decimated Europe in the Middle Ages, the same one that killed, 60% of the population in places in Italy and other places that were just decimated. The plague went away, never fully went away, though. It came back in about 1870 in southwestern China. Plague, for some reason, scientists think that's where plague just has originated. They don't really know why, but they don't know why it goes away. They don't really know why it comes back. So it came back. It started spreading, started going down the Pearl River to Hong Kong. From then Hong Kong, it started going on steamships and started going around the world. So in China, about 10 million people died. India, about 5 million people died. Suddenly it was in Australia, it was in Hawaii, it was in Scotland. It was the start of the third known pandemic of bubonic plague. It's called bubonic plague because when you get infected, you have a swollen lymph node that fills with blood and it turns black, and that's what's known as a bubo. Plague then kills you in about 48 to 72 hours after the first bubo is seen on your body. It's usually in your groin or your armpits. You get high fever, you get delirium, you have foam coming out of your mouth. It's a incredibly painful and fairly quick way to die. It is spread. We now know that it's spread through fleas that are on rats. They did not know this at the time of the San Francisco plague outbreak. So when it reached Honolulu, it was in the outbreak there was in the Chinatown in Honolulu, which is a large Chinatown. As it was spreading, it quickly became seen as a racial disease. This was a time when Hawaii was still not a state. The monarchy had been overthrown, but it existed in this netherworld where white Hawaiians who led the central coup against the Hawaiian monarchy, they wanted to be annexed by the U.S., but they had not been yet. So plague started spreading in Honolulu's Chinatown. Nobody knows how to treat it. So what they decided to do is let's burn it away. Almost satisfied some deep urge. So they tried to burn every building that had a plague victim in it. They were doing this, and then they were lighting one house on fire. The winds changed, and suddenly all of Chinatown was on fire. Instead of letting people flee to safety, police officers and firemen and just white Hawaiians carrying rifles and knives and other things tried to forcibly prevent anybody from escaping Chinatown. Eventually, people relented, and they allowed all the residents of Chinatown, to go to a makeshift barracks where everybody was essentially treated as prisoners for several weeks. Had to shower in public in front of doctors. And it was really this idea that, this is a disease of quote unquote, the other, someone who is Asian, someone who's not white, someone who might not have as much money. And it seemed like it was only a matter of time before it reached the U.S. For the first time in history.
Right. So there's a lot to unpack there. There's this kind of racial or like xenophobic element of, plague is for the unwashed masses. It's something that occurs amongst those in poverty, and especially amongst those who are like immigrants. And so that guided a lot of policy at the time. But one thing I guess I didn't realize is that, we know now, and I think it might be common knowledge, how to treat plague, or at least how to prevent its spread, which, a big part of it is just hygiene. It's very similar to the coronavirus, right? It's about keeping distance. It's about hand washing. It's about, just preventing this spread from person to person. And then, of course, if somebody is found to be positive for plague, it's a bacterial infection, right? So we can treat it with antibiotics.
Yeah, now, it's a course of antibiotics, and you're fine, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
The only question now is how quickly you can get them.
Right.
Someone who might have plague, it looks like other things. The doctor might not know what to do, and the clock starts ticking very quickly. But now plague is really not a disease that most people need to worry about at all. I think what brought me to this book wasn't the idea that, this is this scary disease that's going to come back and kill us all, kind of like a Michael Crichton type story. It was more here's some personalities that show how we treat, or how science works to a certain extent, and how effective science works. And, it was clear as you go through the book that one person who, I'll just say his name, is Dr. Joseph Kenyon. He was known as perhaps one of the most brilliant doctors in the U.S. at the time. He was one of the first bacteriology students. He was really the forefront of this era of people taking medicine away from, the visceral blood and guts to laboratories and microscopes and test tubes and all these other things. And he studied plague. He was he was in Washington. He was, kind of working his way up. He was known as a very smart guy. He also had a personal stake in the development of modern medicine. One of his children, his daughter, died of diphtheria, which used to be a very common and very deadly childhood illness. So he studied in Germany with people who were creating some of the first vaccines and antitoxins and all these other things to treat it. And he wouldn't allow himself at first to believe it. He was watching these kids who were sick just like his daughter, and kind of imagining his daughter's face on each one, and watching them get these injections and suddenly heal. And in the book I described it, it was like as if Prometheus had returned and stolen another secret from the gods. He just couldn't believe what he was seeing, and he started becoming such a strong believer in the strength of science that he thought all illness was going to be was going to be confined to the past. That pretty soon anybody who died of illness was essentially going to be manslaughter. So he is this very idealistic guy. The problem, though, is that he's incredibly smart in the laboratory. He was not able to translate that knowledge to other people. He couldn't get them to trust in him and believe in him. He almost had a talent at making other people hate him. He lacked that kind of social intelligence. So he keeps rising up the ranks of the Marine Health Service, which was the forerunner of the U.S. Public Health Service. So much so that Surgeon General Wyman at the time, he starts, just getting nervous. He doesn't want someone getting kind of too close to his seat of power. So he essentially exiles him to San Francisco, trying to get him as far away from D.C. as possible. So Kenyon is in San Francisco when there's the first known plague victim. And Kenyon, fortunately, knows more about plague than perhaps anybody else in the U.S. He studied with people who have been on the front lines in Japan or in India, and he knows how deadly the disease is, and he knows the pattern of the disease. So he's there not because of the plague, but almost in spite of it. So when there is that first known plague victim, he sees this as his chance at redemption, that, he wants to return to DC where all the people he thinks matters, and he wants to return a hero.
You mentioned the term when you first started to tell this story, personality, which I think is sort of important and telling. It speaks a little bit to how on paper, you might have a plan. In your lab notebook, everything might look right. There may even be like public policy that's being discussed or legislation that's laid down. But one thing that we often forget, I think, when we sort of deify the scientific process the way that we tend to do, is that science is still done by people. And people not only have agendas and biases, but as you mentioned, they also have personalities. And those personalities can be bottlenecks to progress. They can be lubricants to progress. They can lead to collaborative efforts, and they can like literally shut things down. Obviously, we know that living in 2020 and seeing the way that our own leadership has failed so miserably at trying to contain this thing. But you were seeing, really acute examples of that in researching this book, weren't you?
Exactly. That's one thing. Science on paper is very easy. Let's attack this problem, let's figure out what works, and then let's implement the solution. But then when in real life, you realize that, people don't like each other. They want to have the glory, they want to have the credit, or, they just don't want to hang out with somebody who annoys them or something else. And those can all be roadblocks to progress and saving people's lives. And Kenyon really epitomized that in many ways. If you think of him as the really, the hard side of science, of strictly laboratory work or academic microscopes, all those other things, he excelled. But at the softer side of science, and which is getting people to trust you and sharing all this wealth of information that you've gathered and getting people to work with you to implement it, in many ways he was a failure. So the first plague victim was identified. The first known plague victim was identified in March of 1900 in San Francisco. He was a Chinese immigrant by the name of Wang Chuk-king. He was found in a subterranean hovel, essentially, that he shared with three other men. And he was incredibly poor, like many Chinese American immigrants were at the time. When a health inspector was examining his body to write the death certificate, he noticed the bubo on him, and he jumped back here because he knew what it was. So very quickly, Chinatown was quarantined. Police officers strung ropes around Chinatown. And, if you've been to San Francisco, Chinatown's about 12 blocks. It's right in the heart of downtown. And the next day when it was quarantined, the city fell into chaos. People couldn't get through. Suddenly people were not showing up at their jobs. And it became a scandal right away that there was this impulse right on the part of city leaders to deny it, to say there can't possibly be plague here, for many reasons. The economic reason is that San Francisco and California too at the time really was thought of as this golden land. Leave the East Coast and all those other places behind and start your life new here, where you can literally go out into the hills and find gold and come back and be whoever you want to be. And that really doesn't work at the same time to say, we also have bubonic plague here. It's that kind of cognitive dissonance was not something that people could say. Like they're not going to let this disease, the acknowledgement of this disease, destroy their economic progress. And at the same time, you have the racial element that there's this boneheaded idea that there's only somebody who was Asian or did not have European ancestry could get it. That if you were European and your ancestors survived the wave of plague in the Middle Ages, then somehow you had acquired immunity, which was ridiculous. And there's this other idea that it was only people who eat rice and not a manly diet of meat we're going to get plague. So, even if there was plague in San Francisco, many people who were, in the city government or other places in power thought, this disease isn't really that important because it's not going to affect me or my kind of people.
I can only imagine how strange it must have been for you after being kind of, I don't know, like steeped in this research for so long and really like putting your heart and soul into writing this and um I don't know, just having these ideas so in the forefront of your mind that when everything started to pick up here in the States, hearing Trump echoing some of these like racial epithets, calling this the Wuhan flu or the China virus or, even the really atrocious ones like Kung flu. I mean, those kinds of things must have, I don't know, like struck a chord because you were uncovering evidence that this was not a new mentality by any stretch.
That's one thing I think, is forgotten by lots of people, even growing up in California. There's not much acknowledgement of how strong the anti-Asian bigotry was in California at the turn of the 20th century. There was this one labor leader who threatened to say like we should we should block the Golden Gate with the bodies of Chinese immigrants, and it was the mayor of San Francisco ran for the U.S. Senate on a campaign to keep California white. That's literally what his campaign poster said. Um, so that's why you had things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, why you had some of the first racially motivated immigration quotas. Was all part of this anti-Chinese and anti-Asian backlash at the turn of the 20th century in California. And you see it now. It really just, Trump and the other responses to the coronavirus now, it just seems so easy to like, let's blame it on one person or one group of people, as opposed to saying, how can we change our collective behavior to minimize this risk for all of us?
I think that these kind of like racial, or I should just say racist tones are repackaged in 2020. Obviously, there are certain things that are no longer socially acceptable. That doesn't mean that people still don't think them or feel them. They just like code them in different ways. They dog whistle them. I think there's been a resurgence, of course, ever since Trump took office, where things that were definitely not acceptable 5 years ago, for some reason, just are now. But the flavor, I mean, have you noticed that the tonality and the flavor is still very similar? To like the I guess it was probably still much more overt in 1900. This was obviously even before, the civil rights era.
Yeah, it seemed like it was many of the same thoughts just turned all the way up, essentially.
Right.
Um, there was a very similar character. So, kind of taking you through the story some more, Kenyon does discover that plague is truly there. He then starts trying to prevent plague from spreading because he knows that it only takes one person or a couple of people who are infected getting on a train heading east, and suddenly you could have it, in Denver and Chicago and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, New York, all down the line, and it'd be so widespread it'd be impossible to control. It would suddenly be Europe in the Middle Ages again. So he continues to do more and more draconian measures to try to prevent plague from spreading. And to his credit, he doesn't know what else to do. And these are the measures that have seen the best response. Had the best outcomes in Asia and India. So he's trying to do the same things. But he, just doesn't have the social intelligence or the ability to essentially get to do things in the laboratory of the real world. He tries to forcibly inoculate people in Chinatown with a experimental plague vaccine. So people start hiding from him and hiding bodies from him. He causes riots every time he goes into Chinatown itself. He briefly tries to quarantine the entire state of California and says that no one can if they don't have a handwritten notice from him saying that they're healthy. So he draws the ire of Governor Henry Gage, who was this Trumpian figure. He was actually he grew up as a sheep farmer in Los Angeles, and then became a lawyer. And he really thought of himself as this embodiment of rugged individualism. That all you needed was to be a strong person who was capable of being could take care of themselves in the natural world, and you'd be fine. And he really was thought of him as this force against urbanism and more connected California, more connected world. Um, and he also thought of science, of medicine especially, as it's something that you do, and there's got to be blood and guts. If you're somebody in a lab with a microscope, he called Kenyon a beardless boy. Thinking of him as not manly and anything else. So he starts making up nicknames for Kenyon. He starts calling him Suspicious Kenyon or Lying Kenyon. And you started seeing the newspapers in San Francisco pick up on this. It was almost like everything was Fox News. And
yeah, like Fauci, this guy is Fauci.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh no.
Yeah, exactly. So he, and that's the other thing that struck me too. You had this kind of perfect storm where you had the city that wanted to be in denial. You had the Asian American community who wanted to be in denial that plague was there, because they didn't want to acknowledge that, the worst fears and the worst stereotypes could be somehow be given credence to, because there is this disease there.
Right. Like to take on that kind of social responsibility or guilt or shame that was obviously being pushed on them anyway.
Exactly. And then you had the local newspapers, and which was the dominant media force at the time, essentially saying, we're not going to report the truth of this outbreak at all, and we're going to disparage anybody who does try to. So you had local newspapers reporting nothing about the plague, where you would have wire services or other out of town newspapers writing large articles or long articles saying, this many people have died. So within the first year, there were more than 700 or so known cases of the plague, known deaths from the plague in San Francisco. It was likely many, many, many times higher than that, because Kenyon just had such a hard time essentially finding the bodies and finding how the disease was spreading and where it was spreading. So he just knew that this disease, which was capable of ruining the country, was spreading under his watch, and he desperately tried to find a way to contain it.
I'm reminded, I took a little bit of time out of the U.S. in the middle of all of this nonsense, which was weird and interesting. I actually traveled to Scotland before the borders were closed and spent 6 weeks there in a pretty remote part of Scotland, just trying to reset a little bit. And while I was there, I read The Plague by Camus. And I'm kind of struck by the similarities, but also the vast differences that I came across. So for people who haven't read this really important book, he writes about a bubonic plague outbreak in a fake city, but similar to where he grew up, which was in a French colonial part of North Africa. So kind of like Algeria or Morocco. But it's like a small town. And what you find was that the racial component isn't written about much. Interestingly, there's not much racism in the book, which is kind of surprising considering the setting and the time period. But also, because it's a smallish town, they literally lock the city gates. It's one of those old school towns where there's a fence, a gate into the city, and there's sentries posted, and they keep people from going in and going out. And then they have all of these social kind of things that they do to try to contain the virus. And so I'm struck by how different, an outbreak in a city like San Francisco, or I think now, coronavirus, when it first hit in New York City, how much harder it is to contain something in a really metropolitan city where you really can't control or isolate or I guess quarantine the residents so readily.
That's one thing that's been so kind of mind blowing over the last 6 months, is that at Reuters, I work in Times Square itself. Our office is 3 Times Square. We're right across from my window, from my desk at work. I can see the ball, the ball
Mhm.
for New Year's Eve. And just watching how everything shut down. In some ways, the fact that New York is so based on public transportation, it made it easier to shut down because, suddenly if the subway, everybody stopped taking the subway or stopped taking the trains or buses or anything else. So all life in the city just shattered or, shuttered very quickly. It's harder when you're in a population where everyone has cars and they have their own, they can just go wherever they want. You can't
Yeah.
stop somebody from driving.
I I wonder too, I mean, not wonder, but I think that so much of it, just like kind of the great democratic experiment that is the American government, like so much of it, I think, relies on a sort of social contract of everybody sort of playing the game together and having similar goals in mind. So when, coronavirus first hit and we finally realized that it was a real existential threat and that this wasn't going to be contained, there was a push to say, like, we have to do our parts. And to some extent it worked. The problem is when there are leaders who, instead of, I think, promoting messages of unity and, patriotism and let's do our part and let's all, engage in socially responsible behavior, when there are messages of division and distrust and all of these toxic kind of personality traits that you so beautifully paint a picture of, that say, like, don't worry about it, or it doesn't apply to us, or it's only only Chinese people have to worry about it, or whatever the case may be. um, it, it does seem like without that kind of division, there's almost like a contract, like an honor system that people tend to abide by. You see that happening in a lot of European countries.
That's one thing I thought was so fascinating with the plague outbreak in San Francisco too, is that it almost seemed like this perfect storm of toxic elements that, you had this place where, San Francisco sprung up. What we know of San Francisco now essentially sprung up overnight as soon as gold was discovered.
Mm,
And, when you have a city based on the idea that you just have to be lucky, you're going to be wealthy. There's not
mm,
much. There's not much an idea of a social contract. There's not much of an idea of that. We're in this collectively together. Nobody goes and searches for gold and becomes a gold miner because they think they're just better at finding gold than anybody else. They're just hoping to be lucky. So it's really this every person for themselves mindset. And as San Francisco grew, the spending on public health actually declined. So you started having this metropolis with the same health problems as a boomtown. You would have dead horses in the middle of the street that no one would pick up. You would have trash everywhere. You would have, human waste everywhere. And there wasn't this idea of that, we're all in this together. It was essentially, we're going to go out to California because we're going to try to be lucky, and it's a beautiful country. And I think I'm going to be blessed and fortunate, and that's all I need. It wasn't this idea of that, we have to collectively work to fight the elements or whatever else it was that helped forge different cities. So you had this disease that could really only be defeated through collective action at a place where no one wanted to act collectively.
it really speaks to this, I think, moral, how do I word this? This sort of ethical or moral stance that I personally have a difficult time with being an American, right? Like, although I love being from America and I feel very lucky and I enjoy the privilege that it affords me, I think that one of our biggest downfalls is something that many Americans actually see as a strength, which is this like classical individualist manifest destiny, nationalistic view that, like, we can all be rags to riches, that we can all fulfill some sort of American dream if we just work hard enough. But really what that means is we've got to take advantage of other people. We have to take advantage of the privilege that we were born into. We know that America doesn't have a lot of social mobility. And sort of the story that you tell about the template or like the context of San Francisco at the time that the bubonic plague unfortunately made its way to the shores was that classic Manifest Destiny story.
Exactly. And then it really just showed the limitations of it, that, you can tell yourself this story that I don't need anybody else's help and I'm going to do it myself. And, I found this nugget of gold because it was just in my fate and it was always meant for me. That might work for a while, but then eventually you're going to have a real city and you're going to have to find these solutions to different problems that are going to come up. And, you could be the wealthiest person in the world, but that doesn't really matter to a rat. That rat is going to come through and that rat could have a flea on it that has bubonic plague, festering in its gut. And if that flea bites you, you will still die. So
Right.
it really was. And, later in the story, so Kenyon, he was a failure in many ways. And he was kind of the tragic character of the book, is that he knew what was coming and he knew the best he could, he was following the best practices, essentially, what had worked before, to try to save people who didn't want to be saved. And, there was a scandal. It went all the way to the White House, and there was a deal, essentially, that, we're going to kick Kenyon out, and we're going to send him to Michigan and hopefully never hear from him again, in exchange for federal money to do a cleanup of Chinatown. And then this other person came in, Dr. Rupert Blue, who essentially took over from Kenyon as the head of the group of the doctors who were trying to prevent plague from spreading. And he was the opposite of Kenyon in many ways. Kenyon was the smartest guy in the room all the time. Blue, nobody ever thought of him as a brilliant person. He barely graduated med school. He never really made a name for himself. He was just kind of known for being a nice guy. And one thing that I, really liked about him is that he had that kind of intellectual humility to say, I don't have all the answers. So what my skill set is going to be is to essentially find other people who do and try to find consensus. So he started doing all these things that were considered radical at the time. He hired Chinese translators and paid them the same that he did the white members on staff who were white. He opened up a office in Chinatown itself and started walking through the streets trying to forge social connections with people. And it started to work. People started bringing, cases to him. And he also started to say, I'm going to look at this from different ways. I'm not just going to focus on, very draconian measures like Kenyon. I'm going to see what else I can do. I'm going to try to attack this problem from different ways. So, he started focusing on rat eradication. He started focusing on sanitation measures too, and, cleaning up the city. And that's one thing that really struck me working on the book. So many things you think of as just common sense, like we'll have street sweeping and we're going to have concrete sidewalks and we're going to have rat-proof trash cans and, all these other things. They were radical ideas in the beginning of the 20th century. And it's amazing how clean cities are. Even if you walk through most cities now and you think, oh, that's dirty, it's nothing compared to what cities look like, the late 1800s, early 1900s. New York City, when you used to walk through the meatpacking district, there literally was just, blood oozing into the street, and kids would, you give a kid 15 cents and they'd sweep a path through the muck for you. And then you could get through it with, your clothes unscathed, but they would come right back. And, cities were nasty, disgusting places and filled with disease. And now, 8.5 million, almost 9 million people live in New York. And if it wasn't for the, pandemic now, it's a relatively healthy, clean place to live, considering its density.
It sounds to me like what this new physician really brought to the table was a sort of in many ways kind of like pioneering science communication, public health, these multidisciplinary, collaborative, translational approaches that are so fundamental to a healthy society. But even today, like, this is a path that was cleared for people like myself and my colleagues to follow in those footsteps. But even today, we struggle to get appropriate funding or to get, the type of recognition that's necessary to say, like, guys, it's important. Like, science communication, for example, translating published, academic ease into language that the general public and also our politicians can understand so that we can affect policy, for example. Like, these are things that we're still fighting for. But at the turn of the century, it sounds like this was really pioneering.
Exactly. So one thing that Blue did, which was so helpful in many ways, not just the rat eradication program, which I always found fascinating, that he literally would pay people to bring in as many rats as they could, because they were trying to, they would do essentially autopsies of each rat and find out if they had the plague or not, and they would do rudimentary data visualization and try to make a map and put a red cross where every known rat who was infected was found. But beyond that, he also he and a team of surgeons would talk to every group who would have them. He'd talk to women's groups, he would talk to the business elite like Levi Strauss and other people, he would talk to longshoremen and tell them that the best thing they could do if they loved California, if they loved San Francisco, and if they loved their family, was to kill as many rats as possible and to make the city as inhospitable to rats as possible. And there's this idea that rats were scavengers, so if you had trash, just throw it on the ground. Rats will eat it. That's what they're there for. This idea that cities could be clean and their sanitation could be key part of human life and prosperity was a really radical idea. And that's Blue in many ways. He was the opposite of Kenyon. Kenyon was the hard part of science, the hard side of science, which was laboratories and research and everything else. Blue was the soft side. Like, how do you convince people to change their behavior? And that's been such an issue now. Many studies have shown that wearing a mask for coronavirus is incredibly effective. It's not going to stop everything, obviously, but you see studies that if everybody wore a mask, the disease would die out over a period of 3 weeks, 6 weeks, I don't know, something like that.
Quick, yeah, or at least it would become much more confined, much more contained, and just the numbers would plummet if we wore masks.
And it's an action that's not that difficult to do. It's just simply someone convincing someone to change their behavior to help not only themselves but others. That's usually the hardest part of science. And Blue showed that there's a path to do that. And he did it perhaps under the scariest circumstances.
Yeah. And of course, we now have good kind of social psychology and marketing research and, behavioral economics research to help us understand how to change people's minds and how to affect change in that way. Yet still, we really struggle to do so. The mask wearing situation, for example, is one that frustrates me to no end, because in many ways, it's really the only thing we are empowered to be able to do as individuals. It's like social distance, wear a mask, wash your hands. These are three things that we don't have to have a medical degree. We don't have to have money. We don't have to have any sort of influence over the public necessarily. Like, if we as individuals engage in these behaviors, we're doing our parts. But that kind of collectivist, as we said, mentality is so alien to the American kind of social fabric that it's Sisyphean to, it's like there's certain people who are just like, yeah, of course. And luckily that's a large percentage of people in certain parts of the country. But there's so much pushback to this day. And it's frustrating for people who think in an evidence-based way, I think, to just watch like somebody continuously burn themselves when they could very easily not do so.
That's one thing I was struck by too, is that, you can have science that knows how to do things like change somebody's life, whether it's marketing or behavior economics or something else. But one thing I was really struck by working on the book is that, people seem to be experts in one sliver, one side.
Right.
Like they
Yep.
know hard science, but they have no idea how to change somebody's mind. And, somebody who's great at marketing might have no idea that, wait, I can use the same skill to get people to save their lives and others. That kind of cross disciplining is less frequent than you would hope for.
Yeah, it's a huge problem in academia. I think we're getting better at being multidisciplinary, but you're right. Like I think part of it is it's the nature of expertise, right? Like the joke is always that by the time you finish your undergraduate degree, you know a little bit about a lot. And by the time you finish your PhD or your medical degree, you know a whole lot about very little. And the more siloed you become, the less you can really see all of the translational, multidisciplinary applications of your work, which is so sad because, of course, we can always apply these things to other areas.
That's one thing I was really struck by when I was working on my first book about sleep science. I talked to one doctor who, you'd ask them about how to get infants to sleep, and they'd be an expert. And you'd ask, okay, what about a 30-year-old adult? And they'd have no idea. Or, you talk to somebody who would know absolutely everything about sleep apnea, and you ask them a question about sleepwalking, and they look at you like you were from the moon. They just had no idea. And you'd think, oh, if these are both sleep doctors, it's still something with sleep. It should be applicable. And it was not at all. So you see the same thing, and that's a pretty small world. There's not that many sleep scientists out there, and sleep is a very young field of science. So, you start, you kind of make the same through line to public health that, there are people who, like Kenyon, who knew so much and was, a hero in so many ways. But the tragedy was they just couldn't communicate all that knowledge to save other people's lives.
Yeah, it's like, why do I have so many, authors and journalists like yourself on my show, as opposed to the scientists who are doing the work? Not that I don't often have scientists on my show as well, but I tend only to book scientists who I know have public science communication skills, or they maybe have been working on writing popular books in addition to the laboratory research that they do, or they're kind of celebrated as amazing professors and teachers or, speakers. And that's because it's moot if nobody can understand what the hell you're talking about. Like, there's no point in having the conversation. And it's so sad how much really brilliant information and like discoveries have been made that most people just don't even know exist, because nobody has been able to dig through those peer-reviewed, paywalled publications and disseminate that information. Because also, there's a bias, I think, in science journalism and science media to not talk about incremental advancements, to only talk about, headlines that are weird or wacky or turn what you thought on its head. We always joke in SciComm that, like, if you want to publish an article really readily in like a big science outlet, it should be about, sex, chocolate, and dinosaurs. Like, if you could work those three, and maybe like black holes, if you could work all of that into the publication, then maybe somebody will click on it. And it's something that continues to frustrate me personally to this day, but it also makes me wonder, and I would love to hear your insight on this. After digging so deep into this story of the 1900 bubonic plague in San Francisco, knowing then when the 1918 flu pandemic, which of course was different, it was a virus. We thought it was bacterial at first. We didn't know about viruses. We didn't really know how to treat viruses. But the public health measures were relatively similar. Do you feel like San Francisco, after kind of learning the hard way and going through these burning their hand on the stove 10 times in a row, was better prepared, similar to how many, like South Korea and some other Asian countries, were better prepared for SARS-CoV 2 when, the coronavirus like COVID-19 after having gone through SARS the first time.
That's a good point. One thing I was always struck by was that, there is a direct connection between the plague in San Francisco and the 1918 flu outbreak, which was Rupert Blue. He saved San Francisco from the plague, and he was also the Surgeon General during the 1819 flu outbreak.
So he had all that knowledge with him in office at that point.
Yeah. And that's kind of the tragedy of his life, was that all the things that worked containing plague, which was, let's convince people to change their behavior as much as we can. Let's get this collective action. Let's seek input from as many people as possible to find a new solution, which was killing rats. It didn't work on a national scale. They had a very hard time at first convincing people to wear masks and to not gather in groups and all these other things. And, to be fair to him, he was kind of undercut, that he had this dual mission of, let's prevent this pandemic from killing millions, while also you're also responsible for the health of veterans returning from, World War One.
Right.
So that was a lot to take. It's a big sandwich to try to eat at once,
And also the virus was more difficult. We knew less about it. It's much smaller. It spreads, via more airborne transmission. Like, it's totally different than this bubonic plague, which is much more containable.
Yeah, the plague in San Francisco never really reached the pneumatic stage, which is when it spread by coughing. That's what really decimated Europe, was that it did reach that stage. And flu obviously is spread by coughing and sneezing and all those kind of bodily fluids. I think that San Francisco did start, this went into the 1918 flu outbreak with that kind of collective memory of, we can change our behavior and we can have positive outcomes. So that's why, you started seeing very early in California, people having school outside. I saw pictures of, barbers working outside on the streets of Berkeley really relatively early. But I think that, like plague and like the flu outbreak in 1918, these were things that were kind of quickly forgotten by most people. People now think of the 1918 flu outbreak, and it's pretty well known because of coronavirus. They wouldn't have thought about it or known about it, most likely before. I always thought that was so strange when you would take history classes or economics classes, and they would talk about, all these economic forces and this changed and that changed. And they wouldn't talk about, how diseases were affecting people. I know that, I think it's Gerald Diamond, something like that, professor at UCLA, who's written books about how, I think it's Germs, Guns, and Steel is the famous book about, how disease has such a huge impact on the economy and people's lives, but it's so easily forgotten too. Nobody knew about 1958 flu outbreak. It's never thought of, and that killed tens of thousands of people and caused a recession and all these other things in the U.S. So I think I'm hoping that if there is something good that comes out of this pandemic, it's that there is going to be that awareness of public health measures and what we can do to kind of save not only our lives and other people's as well. It's strange to think, if I ever do get on an airplane again for the rest of my life, I'm most likely going to wear a mask, even if there isn't a pandemic going on, just because now it seems like that's a responsible thing to do.
Right. And we may not, shake hands. Like, that might not be a normal social thing that people do in the future when they are meeting for a business meeting or something.
Exactly. It kind of seems like it's gone on long enough, 6 months or so, 7 months or so, that's pretty long to, that forms a new habit pretty quickly.
I know it's funny. I mean, I know this is a little off topic, but I'm, as somebody who studies psychology and neuroscience, I'm often thinking about human development and human behavior. And I'm really struck with how this must be influencing young children during a really developmentally critical period for them, and how, I'm wondering how many sort of like neuroses, how many disorders of sort of anxiety are we're going to start seeing, and also what it must be like for this to be your template, like your schema, your normal, see, to grow up in this. And then when we kind of quote go back to normal, or at least start to go back to a new normal, what that's going to look like for young children. Are they going to be freaked out by how many people there are out in public? Is it going to be overwhelming or uncomfortable for them to be expected to hug everybody in their classroom or hug their teachers or their family members again? I don't know. It's really interesting kind of massive social experiment that's going on.
I have a 8 and 6 year old and a essentially my control group at our house.
Mm-hmm.
I can say that, they wearing a mask now seems like second nature to them. You know, I think if they don't get to do Halloween, that'll be devastating for them. But I think they seem so much more resilient than I kind of gave them credit for, and I think it's like the it's fortunate to be that age, that you're old enough to have made social friends and have that social skills. You're not like a 1.5-year-old or 2-year-old trying to hang out with other people for the first time ever, but you're also not a middle schooler or a high schooler who desperately needs to hang out with somebody besides their family. We're kind of in that happy medium right now.
Yeah, like they'll bounce back, but they also developed kind of a template of what kind of our social normal interaction is when they were young, pre-pandemic. But it's true. I think we also often think about these things using a very American lens. Like, things are so weird. Everybody's wearing masks. And then it's like you go to Asia and like, that's a huge part of the culture in a lot of Asian countries. You wear masks when you're sick. Like, it's not uncommon to see people in masks all the time out in public.
Yeah. It's like, why didn't we not do that before? It just seems so logical. It's like, why didn't I never think of wearing a mask on an airplane? I'm always going to wear a mask.
Right. Yeah. And like, I'm always going to have hand sanitizer on me. Whereas before, you might have thought of people who always carried it as being a little neurotic or a little germophobic. Now that's like the norm for sure.
Yeah. Now, like when I go out in public, no one's going to see my face ever. I'm always just going to wear a mask.
Seriously. Well, gosh, I feel like we've learned so much. There's so much more to learn. And what I love about your book, Black Death at the Golden Gate, The Race to Save America from the Bubonic Plague, is that not only is it, it's a nonfiction book, so it's super informative, but and has like the social commentary aspects and stuff, but it really does read like a thriller. Like it's a narrative, it's a story with characters, and you don't know what's going to happen next because, of course, our American education system probably never taught us about this, sadly. And so what I love about it is that it does have that page turner quality to it. And I think that people who maybe mostly just read literature or fiction will still have that sort of relationship with this book. So guys, I highly recommend it. And David, before we go, I was hoping, I always ask my guests the same 2 closing questions, and I'm definitely interested in your take on these for many reasons. One, because of the reporting that you do for Reuters, and kind of your real focus on neutrality in reporting and following those, journalistic ethos. But 2, because of what you've learned from doing these deep dive books that you've written, I would love to know first, when you think about the future, what is the thing that is keeping you up the most at night? The thing that you are most concerned about, maybe pessimistic, maybe even, I don't know, cynical about. But then on the flip side of that, what is the thing that you are genuinely, like authentically hopeful for? What are you optimistic and really looking forward to?
I'd say for the worries side, it's hard not to be worried about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
growing up, I grew up in California. Now live on the East Coast. But, getting pictures from friends of an orange sky at
Yeah.
12 and noon, or you just think of, how, Superstorm Sandy, or, my mom lives in Florida where Hurricane Michael was essentially a 150-mile wide Category 5 tornado. It's just going to happen more and more often. So it's hard not to be, existentially concerned about that.
Mm-hmm.
But hopefully on the other side, and maybe this is just from the lens, my wife is a speech pathologist. She works in public schools, and we have 2 young kids. It sounds like a cheesy answer, but it's really not. The kids are so much nicer now than they used to be. Like my wife works at a high school sometimes, and she works with kids with, special needs, and some of them have significant levels of special needs. And kids, all the other, the typically developing kids, mainstream kids, they go out of their way to be nice to them, to help them.
Mm-hmm.
And, I grew up and, I was in high school in the 90s, and that was not the case. And, and I even grew up in a, middle-class place where people were, conditioned to, hopefully treat people nicely. And that was just not the case, and now there's a shift to recognizing the validity and humanity of other people in a way that was not recognized before. It seems, when you look back, it seems insane that Juneteenth was not a well-known holiday until this year. And hopefully things will continue to gather steam and continue to make a world that's just, whether we're all living in one of those SimCity bubbles, that's the only way we can survive. At least we'll be nice to each other.
I think you're right. I think that when we were kids, the focus was on tolerance, and kids today, the focus is on empathy and celebrating other people. It's like so much beyond tolerance or even acceptance, like that was the bar back in the day. You were like a good kind of citizen, of humanity if you just tolerated other people. And now it really is about like, ooh, my friend is really different from me. Look how cool it is that she has 2 moms, or look how cool it is that she's, got, different orientation or different gender identity or whatever. And I think that's a really cool kind of progress that we've been making. You're right.
I think it was I think it was the actress who was on what was that show? I'm blanking on this. Master of None. Lena Waithe, I think. I might be.
Yeah. Oh, I love Lena Waithe.
Yeah. Wasn't she saying like the thing that makes you different, that's your superpower?
Right.
And that's just a fantastic way of thinking about it. You can sell it. It's not just tolerance, which is just, okay, there's other people and I have to put up with them. There's so much more that my life experience is richer because I can understand their life experience. And, I think that hopefully will continue.
Absolutely. Well, David, thank you so much for taking time out of your day today for sharing the story of the Black Death at the Golden Gate and sharing some of your insights. It was really informative and I had a lot of fun.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.